I think my travels and speaking sort of more than one language, French is my mother tongue and I speak Spanish quite well. It does shape you, of course. I think mainly traveling especially opened up my mind. My parents, I had the luck of having parents who were peripatetic, first of all as students and then as diplomats. They worked for the equivalent of the Secretary of State. They were diplomats working for Canada's Foreign Affairs Department. So we lived in Costa Rica as a child. When I was a child, I also lived in Paris, in Mexico as a young man. And then I got that bug, and on my own I continued traveling. So traveling to me is like reading in a sense. You are in a foreign element, encountering foreign characters, and they mold you. Because when you travel, you necessarily open yourself up. I mean, I just arrived in New York this morning out of what's it called, Union Station, or is it Penn Station here? Anyway, whatever it's called here. I come out and suddenly I'm in the heart of New York, and you can't ignore that. You cannot ignore what's happening to you when you travel. And so it opens you up. It was a lot colder this morning in New York than it was in Washington, so even just the weather. But then all the people, the way they walk, the way they talk, they're the buzz of activity of New York, as opposed to sort of the quieter pace of, Tempe, where I was earlier. That opens you up. And then when you encounter different people, you realize to what extent there are different ways of being on this earth. Obvious ways of speaking, but ways of thinking, ways of dressing, ways of eating, ways of relating to each other. And in a sense what that does is it gives you options. Each one of us can be slightly different than what we are. Life is a matter of taking what you're given and then going with it somewhere. You can evolve, you can change, you can learn, you can relearn. And I think traveling teaches you that. And as for languages, language is an interesting one, because I find languages can both be an open door and a closed door. So yes, growing up speaking more than one language, learning more than one language and speaking more than one language, it shows you comparative ways in which things can be explained. So there's obvious differences between English and French. One thing, for example, that was lost in English that we still have in French is different levels of familiarity when you're talking to people. So in French, when you know someone well, you will say tu. Comment vas-tu? How are you? But the tu is a familiar form of you. It implies that you know the person well. Either the person is younger or is an intimate. And if it's someone you don't know that you're meeting for the first time, you would say comment allez-vous? You'd say vous. Now, we used to have that in English. You used to be the formal one. I'd say, how are you when I didn't know you? If I knew you well, I'd say, how art thou? We'd say thou, and that's been lost. And that's a nuance that's interesting to be aware of. When you speak French, it's a little fork in the road that you are constantly coming to. You instantly have to know how do you speak to people. In Quebec, where I'm from, for example, we get to tu, to the familiar thou, much more quickly. In France, you will stick to vous much longer. It's a slightly more formal society. It's more aware of its formalities. So that gives you a sense right away of how language can be distancing or get you closer to people. And also there's sometimes some languages have more obviously a word at hand to describe a situation or something than another language. And they also have a very different spirit. English is wonderful because it's such a cannibal. English, English of course is a Germanic language, but spoken by these people on this dank little island called England. But because of Christianization, because of the Norman invasion, there's a huge influence of Latin languages, French and of Latin on the English language. And then because of colonialism, of course the English colonized the world, well, the language has an enormous vocabulary. It's an enormously flexible machine that swallows up words all the time. So it's a beautiful language because of its variety of vocabulary. But what I retain from learning French, for example, from speaking French, is of the 26 letters of the English alphabet, I pity the letter R. The letter R is a very sad letter in English. It has no backbone, unless you're Scottish. So, most of us, when we say rural road, the rural roads of Rhode Island, the R is not a very Whereas you compare it to French, in French it'd be route rurale. It's much more guttural in French, route rurale. So unless you're Scottish and you say rural roads, the rural roads of Rhode Island, then it has a real personality. So that's one more thing when I'm writing in English, or when I'm speaking English actually, I sort of always miss that resonant R that we have in French. So language is an interesting thing because it's like these patterns of colors and you can compare them. But I would also argue, and this is the converse side, in a sense what you don't want to hear, is often I find languages are a closed door. So for example, India, what's wonderful about traveling to India is that most everyone with any education in India will speak English, which means despite the fact that India, they speak over 200 languages, is a multi-millennial civilization. It's a continent civilization. It's very accessible to those of us who speak English because they make it accessible by speaking English. Compare that when you go to China, where Mandarin and Cantonese are walls, because few of us Westerners speak Chinese, which means immediately you cannot tell if a door says this is the bathroom or this is the emergency. You have no idea what it says. Immediately everything is a barrier. So hence the usefulness of people speaking more than one language or a universal language. Now, I'm not advocating English imperialism, but the fact that it is a language that is spoken by people in their billions does mean that we can reach out to people where we wouldn't otherwise. It makes a huge difference when you can speak a language and you can understand the people you are encountering. Otherwise you're reduced to sign language and pidgin English or pidgin whatever else. I find when I'm writing in different languages that it can shape what I'm wanting to say, but only if I don't make an effort. If I make an effort, then no, it doesn't. This idea that, for example, that Inuit will have 40 words for snow and that English only has snow is not true. You just have to talk to skiers. English language skiers will give you 40 different ways of expressing different ice conditions, different snow conditions. I think any language can do the job it needs to do given a little time. Every language will come up with neologisms, new words, to express new ideas. Those new ideas just have to come in and be encountered by the language, and then it will. And English is a perfect example. English is coining, I just thought of, for example, smartphone. The word smartphone didn't exist, 10 years ago. But now when we say a smartphone, we know what we're talking about. Any language can do that. Some are more adept at it, some are more nimble. English is extraordinarily nimble. France, for example, French is slightly less. It's interesting if you look at the difference between French in France and French in Quebec. In Quebec, a parking lot is un terrain de stationnement. In France, they'll call it un parking. Quebec, because they're surrounded, 6 million francophones are surrounded by an ocean of anglophones, 300 million anglophones, Canadians and American. They tend to resist English words coming into it. So in Quebec, a sweater is un chandail. In France, they'll say pullover, pullover. They'll use an English word that they've Frenchified. Really funny one in France is to go jogging is faire du footing. Now, footing is not a word in English. No one says, I'm going to go footing. It doesn't make, you can foot a bill maybe or something, but you don't go footing. So it's there the English have used an English word that doesn't really exist as a word for jogging. In French, in Quebec, you would never say footing. You'd be laughed out of the room if you said footing in Quebec. So it's interesting. So some languages are more adept at taking on new ideas. But fundamentally, I think, and this is where writers and artists come into play, they're the ones who renew the language, and they will do it when they see, where they see and when they see a need.